Marcus Thorne walked into the Gilded Spoon, armed with a grudge and an acquisition offer, ready to buy a bad memory. He had no idea he was the one about to be acquired. The fluorescent lights of the Gilded Spoon always felt too harsh, but today they seemed to specifically target the sweat beading on my forehead. I'd driven 300 miles, pushing my aging sedan to its limits, just to be here, in this aggressively quaint, overly decorated monument to colonial-era dining in the heart of rural Virginia. I wasn't here for the ambience, though. I was here for the principle. I smoothed down the lapels of my bespoke suit. It was expensive, tailored in Milan, and it definitely didn't blend with the khaki and polyester uniforms of the waitstaff shuffling around nervously. My name is Marcus Thorne, and while I might look like just another successful black man looking for a nice lunch, the reality was far more complicated. I was here to buy a bad memory, and perhaps teach a very expensive lesson. I took a seat at a small, slightly wobbly table near the window, deliberately ignoring the host who hadn't quite managed to look me in the eye before seating me. He seemed more interested in adjusting the silverware than actually seating a customer. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through emails, making a show of being a busy man waiting patiently. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The restaurant wasn't packed. There were perhaps 4 other tables occupied, mostly older white couples sipping iced tea. I watched as a server, a young man whose name tag I vaguely recalled from an old news clipping, read Chad, flitted between tables. Chad delivered a basket of sourdough to the couple across the aisle. He refilled Mrs. Henderson's water glass with theatrical politeness. He even stopped to chuckle warmly at a joke Mr. Henderson made about the local golf course. But Chad wouldn't look my way. I cleared my throat, loud enough to carry, but subtle enough that it wouldn't sound like an outright demand. Nothing. He glanced vaguely in my direction, his eyes sliding right over me as if I were a pane of slightly dusty glass. 15 minutes. The initial buzz of anticipation was curdling into a familiar acidic burn of disrespect. I set my phone down with a gentle, deliberate thud. Finally, Chad approached my table, but not to take my order. He stopped a good 3 feet away, hands clasped tightly behind his back, radiating an aura of profound inconvenience. "Sir," he began, his voice tight, dripping with an accent that sounded cultivated for maximum condescension. "Are you quite finished with the atmosphere? I need to clear this station." "I haven't ordered yet, actually," I replied, keeping my tone level, dangerously calm. "I've been waiting for someone to take my lunch order." Chad actually had the audacity to look down at his little notepad, then back up at me, a slow, judgmental scan taking in my tailored suit, my expensive watch, and yes, my skin color. "Well, we close the kitchen for midday turnover in about 10 minutes, sir. We usually prioritize tables that have been seated longer." He paused, letting the implication hang in the stale air. "Longer than you've been here," implying I shouldn't have been seated at all. I remembered reading about this place. 3 years ago, a local university professor, a brilliant black historian who had moved down from Boston, had written a scathing online review after his engagement proposal lunch here went sideways. He'd claimed the service was abysmal, bordering on hostile. The owner, a man named Bob, had dismissed it as sour grapes from someone not accustomed to our level of service. I had looked up Chad, too. He was Bob's nephew, freshly graduated from community college, recently installed as assistant manager in training. "I see," I said, leaning back slightly. The wobbly table actually gave a little creak of protest. "And what would you recommend from the menu, Chad, since you seem to be the expert on what's available?" Chad blinked, thrown slightly off script by my directness and the use of his name. He shuffled his feet. "Look, man, I told you, the kitchen's about to shut down. If you want something quick, get the BLT. Just tell me now." "The BLT, right. And what about the roasted duck with the cherry reduction? Is that still on the specials board?" Chad visibly scoffed. It was a short, sharp expulsion of air, purely for my benefit. "Sir, with all due respect," he leaned in conspiratorially, dropping his voice to a stage whisper that carried perfectly to the surrounding tables. "That's a 30-minute prep time. We don't do 30-minute prep times for walk-ins who look like they just pulled over on the highway." The implication was clear. I looked like a transient, a drifter, someone who didn't belong, and certainly not someone who deserved the chef's best work. I felt the familiar heat of indignation rise, but I crushed it down. This wasn't about a quick argument. This was about leverage. "I'll take the roasted duck, Chad," I stated firmly, "and a glass of your finest Cabernet Sauvignon, the 1982 Bordeaux, if you have it." Chad's face went crimson. He looked panicked, glancing around wildly. "We don't have an 82 Bordeaux. We have the House Merlot, served by the glass, or the House Chardonnay. And I'm telling you, the duck is off the menu for you right now." "You're telling me what I can and cannot order at this establishment, Chad?" I asked, my voice now low and edged with steel. "I'm telling you the reality of the situation," he hissed back, finally letting the mask slip completely. "You clearly don't know how this place works. Go down the road to that fast food joint if you want service on demand. We have standards here." I steepled my fingers on the table, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful for the other patrons to endure. I then reached into my inner jacket pocket, pulling out a thin, embossed business card. I slid it across the mahogany surface. It stopped just short of his trembling fingers. Chad eyed it suspiciously, then reluctantly picked it up. As he read the stark, silver lettering, his eyes widened in disbelief, then terror, his face draining of all color. The professional mask he wore shattered, revealing the terrified young man beneath. "T. Thorne. Acquisitions?" he stammered, his voice suddenly high and reedy. I allowed myself a small, cold smile. "Marcus Thorne. Acquisitions. That's right. You see, Chad, I had a very good lunch reservation booked for today, but I decided that perhaps a comprehensive property assessment would be more beneficial to my schedule." I stood up slowly, towering over the now petrified waiter. The whole restaurant was silent. Every head was turned. "Tell your uncle, Bob," I continued, my voice carrying just the right amount of weight, "that I'm not here for the duck. I'm here because 3 years ago he told a black professional that he didn't belong in his establishment. And now I'm here to offer him a very generous, non-negotiable buyout offer for this entire property. And I suggest, Chad, that you start being exceedingly polite to me, because if this negotiation goes south, you're going to be looking for a new place to practice your questionable customer service skills by sundown." Chad dropped the card as if it were radioactive. He stumbled backward, bumping into a serving cart, sending a stack of pristine linen napkins cascading to the floor. He didn't even notice. He just stared, mouth agape, realizing he hadn't just insulted a customer. He had just antagonized the man who held the deed to his future in the palm of his hand. I need to get Uncle Bob," he squeaked, spinning around and sprinting toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen, leaving me standing alone, victoriously surveying the stunned room. I knew Bob would come out. He had to. And when he did, he'd see the man he'd dismissed standing right where he was told he didn't belong, waiting for him to sign over the keys. But then a shadow fell over me. Not Chad's, but someone older, heavier. I looked up, expecting Bob, but it was the host, the man who hadn't seen me initially, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, toward the door I had just entered. "Mr. Thorne," the host said, his voice dangerously steady, completely devoid of fear. "Mr. Peterson wanted me to inform you that you won't be needing to speak to Mr. Bob." He took a deliberate step closer, reaching slowly inside his pristine white jacket, not for a notepad, but for something far more substantial. "Mr. Peterson bought the Gilded Spoon 3 weeks ago. He just hasn't changed the name on the lease agreement yet. The air in the dining room didn't just drop in temperature. It felt like it solidified. The stunned silence of the lunchtime patrons curdled into outright alarm. I watched the host's hand emerge from his jacket, and my carefully constructed facade of control fractured in a millisecond. It wasn't a weapon. It was a crisp, thick manila folder, stamped with the seal of a major Atlanta law firm. "Mr. Peterson," the host repeated, his eyes locking onto mine with an unnerving, proprietary gleam. His name tag, I now noticed, was subtly different from the others, etched in a fine silver script that read, "Manager on duty, Elias." Elias made no move to leave, standing sentinel between me and the swinging kitchen doors where Chad had fled. "I don't know any Mr. Peterson," I managed, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears. My mind was racing, calculating. 3 weeks ago? That meant Peterson had been here when the professor wrote his review. Peterson had let Chad and Bob run their little hate parade, knowing he owned the whole operation. This wasn't about a prejudiced owner. This was about a calculated real estate play, using casual bigotry as a cheap barrier to entry. I took a step toward Elias, intending to snatch the folder, but he held it just out of reach. I assure you, you do. Mr. Peterson holds the deed, the liquor license, and, effective yesterday, the mortgage on your family's primary residence in Macon, Mr. Thorne. The blood drained from my face faster than Chad's had moments before. Macon. My aging mother's house. I hadn't even known the refinancing was pending, let alone that the loan had been sold to some shell corporation. Peterson hadn't just bought the restaurant. He had been systematically acquiring leverage against me. The entire setup, the deliberately poor service, the aggressive racism from the staff. It wasn't a mistake Bob or Chad had made. It was bait. They wanted me to come here, publicly outraged, so they could spring the trap. That's slander, I stated, though the tremor in my voice betrayed the hollow nature of the claim. You can't possibly have that documentation ready. Elias gave a slow, almost pitying smile. Mr. Thorne, when you deal in high-stakes acquisition, you don't wait for a hostile takeover to start building your defensive perimeter. You build it weeks in advance. You see, Mr. Thorne, you have a reputation for aggressive, some might say predatory, business practices. Mr. Peterson simply applied your own methods to you. He knew you'd eventually come here, seeking some misguided sense of justice, and he knew exactly what kind of man you are when you're insulted. Elias tapped the folder. Page 1. A detailed analysis of your firm's current debt load. Page 3. A notice of default initiated this morning due to a clause violation related to a non-publicized asset transfer. And on page 11. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes glittering with cold intelligence. Page 11 is a signed, legally binding agreement stating that if you publicly cause any disturbance on this property today, which, given the state of poor Chad, over there, you technically already have, you forfeit all rights to renegotiate the terms of the Macon property loan. In essence, you signed away your mother's home by getting angry at a minimum wage bigot. The implications crashed over me. Peterson had engineered this whole scenario to look like a classic racial conflict, knowing that my pride, my righteous indignation, would be the very thing that destroyed me financially. He'd used the very injustice I came to fight as the mechanism for my downfall. He set me up, I whispered, the realization tasting like ash. He leveraged opportunity, Elias corrected smoothly. He knew the racism here was an attractant for men like you. Now, Mr. Thorne, you have two options. Option 1, you leave this establishment immediately, without a word to anyone here, and we discuss the new, significantly less favorable terms for your Macon property in the quiet sanctity of Mr. Peterson's office tomorrow at noon. Option 2, you continue to make a scene, and by 5 p.m. today, the sheriff's department will be serving eviction papers to your mother. Elias leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, though the entire restaurant was still holding its breath, watching the sudden, spectacular implosion of the wealthy patron. And understand this, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Peterson isn't racist. He's just efficient. He understands that some people are easily baited by perceived slights, and those people are always the easiest to control. He simply used the existing staff's poor behavior as camouflage for his true acquisition strategy. He offered the folder again. I stared at the embossed paper, seeing not a legal document, but the blueprint for my ruin. The sheer audacity, the cold, clinical precision of the trap was breathtaking. I was supposed to be the shark, the one who devoured small businesses, but here I was, being carefully, meticulously gutted by a man I hadn't even known existed until this very moment. I reached out, my hand shaking violently, and took the folder. The weight of it felt monumental. I looked past Elias towards the kitchen door, imagining Bob, the true architect of this psychological warfare, watching from the shadows, perhaps even sharing a laugh with Peterson. Noon, I confirmed, my throat tight. Excellent choice, sir, Elias replied, his posture immediately relaxing. He gestured toward the exit with a practiced, almost mocking politeness. Now, if you'll excuse us, We have to clean up the mess poor Chad made, and perhaps find him a new career path. We wouldn't want him causing any unforeseen disruptions. I turned toward the exit, every eye in the room following me. I pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping back out into the blinding Virginia sunlight, the scent of expensive tailoring suddenly feeling cheap and insufficient. I had come here to make a statement, to deliver a humbling lesson in respect. Instead, I had walked into a perfectly laid, multi-layered ambush. I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, the manila folder resting accusingly on the passenger seat. Peterson thought he had me cornered. He thought he controlled the narrative now. But as I backed out of the parking spot, something clicked. If Peterson was that thorough, if he had been tracking me for weeks, then he must have anticipated my move to flee and regroup. I glanced at my rearview mirror, expecting to see Elias watching, perhaps calling someone. Instead, a sleek, black, unmarked SUV, which hadn't been there 5 minutes ago, pulled swiftly out of the adjacent alley, blocking my only clear path back onto the main road. 2 men, built like refrigerators, sat in the front seats, looking directly at me. They weren't moving to follow. They were moving to contain. Peterson wasn't just waiting for me tomorrow. He was making sure I couldn't run tonight. The sight of the black SUV, a silent, menacing monolith cutting off my exit, punched the last ounce of air from my lungs. This wasn't just financial maneuvering anymore. This was active deterrence. Peterson wasn't waiting until noon. He was ensuring I couldn't even make it back to Macon to consult with my legal team before he tightened the noose. I slammed the car into park, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic, desperate rhythm. I had to think like a predator, not a victim. Peterson played the long game, leveraging existing conflict. I had to short-circuit his timeline. If I stayed in the car, those 2 brutes in the SUV would simply wait until I got out, or worse, they would come to me. I threw the car door open and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, leaving the damning manila folder inside. A piece of evidence I couldn't afford to lose, but couldn't afford to carry right now either. I moved with a sudden, decisive speed, sprinting back towards the front entrance of the Gilded Spoon. I needed chaos. I needed to turn the tables on Elias, and whoever else Peterson had lurking inside, before the SUV blocked the entire lot. I burst back through the heavy glass doors, not bothering with pleasantries. The dining room was a tableau of frozen horror. The older couples were rigid in their seats, silverware halfway to their mouths. Elias, who had been monitoring my departure with smug satisfaction, spun around, his carefully composed expression instantly dissolving into alarm. "Mr. Thorne, I thought we agreed," Elias began, taking a reflexive step back toward the kitchen doors. "We agreed on nothing," I roared, my voice echoing in the sudden tense silence. I didn't stop moving. I swept my gaze across the room, looking for the weak points. The wine rack near the bar, mostly glass bottles, the serving station laden with heavy porcelain plates. "Get your boss on the phone right now, Elias. Tell Peterson that if he lays one finger on my mother's house, I will personally ensure that every single asset he has acquired in this county, this state, maybe this whole miserable corner of the South, is tied up in litigation for the next decade. I will burn his paper empire to the ground." Elias fumbled for the phone on his belt. His earlier confidence utterly evaporated. He looked like a trapped animal. "He's not here. He never is. He runs things remotely." "Then find the remote," I shouted, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a bronze statue of a rather stout-looking French chef holding a ladle, and hefted it. It was heavier than I expected, cold and solid in my hand. I turned toward the nearest table, aiming not at the occupants, but at the antique chandelier hanging precariously above them. "Everyone out, now!" I yelled, pointing the ladle-wielding statue at the ceiling. "This place is compromised." Panic finally broke the spell. The patrons surged toward the exits, bumping into each other in a rush for the daylight. Elias, seeing the danger to the assets he was tasked with protecting, abandoned his phone and lunged toward me, trying to wrestle the statue away. He wasn't expecting the violence of my desperation. I shoved him away with my free hand, sending him sprawling over a velvet rope stanchion. The bronze chef, guided by pure adrenaline, swung upward. I didn't hit the chandelier. Instead, the heavy base connected with the antique, reinforced glass of the front window with a sound like a cannon blast. The window shattered outward in a dazzling explosion of glittering shards. The sound was deafening, a perfect distraction. I didn't look back at the mess. I bolted through the ragged opening, ignoring the superficial cuts on my arms, diving low and rolling onto the gravel near the curb. The black SUV reacted instantly. The passenger door flew open, and one of the refrigerator-sized men, broad, moving with surprising agility, began sprinting toward me. I scrambled to my feet, now officially a fugitive fleeing a potential assault charge, but free of the immediate confinement. The main road was still blocked by the SUV, but the alleyway that Peterson's man had emerged from moments ago was now visible and clear. It was tight, leading between the restaurant and a dry cleaner, barely wide enough for my sedan. I sprinted for my car. The second man from the SUV was running in my direction, pulling out a phone, clearly calling for backup or confirming my escape route. I threw myself into the driver's seat, hands flying to the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the first man reached the driver's side window, his face contorted in rage, slamming his fist against the reinforced glass. I floored the accelerator, not caring about the noise or the attention. I swerved violently, clipping the side mirror of the SUV with a sickening crunch of plastic before roaring into the narrow alleyway. The ride through the alley was jarring. Dumpsters scraped against the paintwork. The undercarriage groaned, but I was moving. I burst out the other side, tires squealing onto a quieter side street, a half-mile from where I'd started, putting distance between myself and the immediate threat. I drove blindly for 10 minutes, heart still pounding, until I reached a deserted stretch of back road lined with ancient oak trees. I pulled over, slamming the gear shift into park, and leaned my head against the steering wheel, gasping for air, tasting blood from where I'd bitten my lip. I had escaped the immediate trap, but I had surrendered the upper hand. Peterson knew my home address, he knew my financial vulnerabilities, and he now knew exactly how far I was willing to go to protect my family. He had the legal documents. I had a wrecked window and a few scratches. I needed to make a move before noon. I reached for my phone, intending to call my own lawyer, the real one, the one Peterson's firm couldn't possibly have bought out, when a notification chimed on the screen. It wasn't a call or a text. It was an alert from my home security system in Macon, usually reserved for package deliveries or perimeter breaches. The alert was an instantaneous high-priority flag. It wasn't a single breach. It was a full system takeover. Every camera feed, every sensor, every electronic lock had gone offline simultaneously, replaced by a single, static image displayed across my phone screen. A high-resolution color photograph of my mother, asleep in her bed, and superimposed over the image, in the same cold silver font used on my own business card, was a single word. Welcome. The world narrowed to the glowing rectangle in my hands. The image of my mother, vulnerable and completely unaware, was Peterson's final, absolute checkmate. The rage that had fueled my flight solidified into a diamond-hard core of focus. He hadn't just bought the loan. He had inserted himself into my personal fortress. This was no longer a business negotiation about real estate. It was a siege. I didn't waste time trying to call the police. Peterson clearly had his tentacles deeper than local jurisdiction. I didn't call my lawyer. They would advise caution, delay, exactly what Peterson was counting on. Noon was too late. Macon was too far. I had to hit him where he lived, right now. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat. I knew the layout of the gilded spoon, not just from the blueprints I'd studied, but from the sudden, terrifying clarity of Elias's explanation. Peterson wasn't on site, but he relied on people like Elias and the two brutes in the SUV to manage the physical details. And if he was controlling everything remotely from a local hub, there had to be a nerve center nearby. I slammed the car into reverse, executed a brutal three-point turn on the narrow side road, and aimed back towards the center of town. Not toward the restaurant itself, but toward the commercial district where Peterson would likely have established his temporary command post, a place that offered high-speed data access and plausible deniability. Given the level of sophistication, it wouldn't be a dingy office. It would be an upscale, anonymous location. I drove like a phantom, keeping to the back streets, the smashed window of my sedan attracting curious glances, but failing to alert the SUV, which was likely still trying to track my initial trajectory out of the county. I remembered a detail from the original property report I was reviewing before my impromptu lunch. The Gilded Spoon was directly adjacent to a historic, independently owned antique shop that had been boarded up for years. Next to that antique shop was a sleek, modern, windowless office building, the kind of structure favored by venture capitalists and silent partners looking to avoid the scrutiny of a public listing. It wasn't on the main street. It was perfectly situated for discreet operations. I pulled my car into the shadow of the boarded-up antique shop. From this vantage point, I could see the only discernible entrance to the modern building, a single heavy steel door tucked beside a loading bay. I grabbed the bronze chef statue from the passenger seat. It was heavy enough to be a weapon, but in this context it was a necessary tool. I slipped out of the car, my Italian suit now covered in the grime of the alleyway, my hands stinging from the broken glass. I approached the steel door cautiously. No keypad, no intercom. Peterson relied on his internal security, Elias and the muscle. I took a deep breath, then swung the statue in a devastating arc, aiming for the electronic lock housing near the doorframe. The impact was sickeningly loud. A massive crunch of metal on metal. Sparks flew, and the door shuddered, the electronic lock sparking uselessly before falling silent. I slammed my shoulder against the steel door once, twice. On the third impact, the weakened frame buckled, and the door swung inward with a terrible screech, revealing a brightly lit, silent corridor. The space inside was hyper-modern. White walls, polished concrete floors, and an unnerving lack of personal touches. It smelled faintly of ozone and expensive air filtration. I moved down the hall, statue raised, my senses hyper-alert. I heard footsteps, not the heavy tread of the SUV men, but a quick, almost panicked shuffle coming from the far end of the corridor, near a set of tinted glass double doors. I rounded the corner, swinging the bronze chef in a low arc meant to sweep the legs out from under anyone in my path. I found Elias there, pale and sweating, clutching a laptop bag. He wasn't trying to fight. He was trying to escape with the evidence. "It ends here, Elias," I snarled, planting my feet. Elias dropped the bag, throwing his hands up. "Wait! Thorne, please. I was just following orders. Peterson is the monster here. Then tell me where he is." "He's not here. He's in Atlanta. He uses remote hubs like this to manage acquisitions. He hasn't been in Virginia for weeks." Elias was babbling, pointing frantically back down the hall. "He only checks in on the local operations when he needs to bait someone. You were the bait." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, processing the confirmation that Peterson wasn't even physically present to witness my humiliation. But the bait was still alive, and my mother was in danger. "The security override," I demanded, leveling the statue at his chest. "How do I reverse the notification to my house?" Elias pointed a trembling finger toward the open office space I had initially bypassed. "The main server rack. It's in there. The one with the blinking red light. If you can access the admin console, you can reset the connection statuses." But Peterson locked it down with two-factor authentication, biometric and a physical key. I shoved Elias aside and charged into the room. It was a small, climate-controlled server room. A single console glowed ominously, displaying the static image of my mother, overlaid with the "welcome" message. Next to the console sat a sophisticated biometric scanner, and tucked neatly into a docking station beside it, a small, antique-looking brass key, the kind you'd find on an old jewelry box. Peterson's hubris was his undoing. He had set the trap so perfectly, so intricately, that he hadn't accounted for the possibility that the victim wouldn't try to run, but would instead charge straight into the heart of his digital trap. I jammed the brass key into the physical slot. It clicked home. The biometric scanner flashed green, momentarily accepting the physical key as a placeholder, waiting for the handprint. I didn't have time to find Peterson's handprint. I only had time to disable the threat. With a guttural yell born of 3 years of suppressed frustration and 3 hours of absolute terror, I raised the heavy bronze statue one last time. I didn't aim for the screen or the keyboard. I aimed for the delicate, interconnected workings of the entire system. The bronze chef smashed down with overwhelming force directly onto the biometric scanner and the central processing unit beneath it. The sound wasn't a crunch. It was an explosive pop, followed by the acrid smell of burning circuitry. Sparks rained down, and the screen displaying my mother flickered violently before going dark. Completely dead. The security feed, every camera, every lock, returned instantly to normal operations. My mother was safe. I stood over the ruined hardware, panting, the bronze statue smoking slightly in my hand. The trap was sprung, but the mechanism was broken. I had sacrificed my position, my reputation, and nearly my freedom, but I had saved my family. Just as I turned to leave the wreckage, ready to face whatever legal consequences followed, my phone, lying on the passenger seat of my car outside, buzzed insistently. I jogged back out, wiping soot from my eyes, and picked it up. It was a voicemail. The caller ID was blocked. I hit play. Instead of Peterson's cold voice or Elias's whiny apologies, there was only a short, clear soundbite, the sound of a cork popping, followed by a rich, satisfied, deeply familiar laugh. Then a synthesized voice, clearly Peterson's modulator, spoke over the laughter. "Well played, Mr. Thorne. You broke my toys. Impressive improvisation, but you missed the real acquisition." The synthesized voice dropped its modulation, sounding chillingly like the clear, cultured tones of the university professor who wrote the original dismissed review 3 years ago. The gilded spoon was never the target. It was the distraction. "Enjoy your evening, Marcus. We'll talk tomorrow about the sale of your firm."